this is a sort of deep and systemic crisis that necessarily therefore involves a systemic response in finance, in how we work, in sort of scaling up the commons, in sort of extending democracy into all spheres of life. But in particular, that systemic crisis isn't a crisis of our imagination, of our technical ability. It's primarily one of a crisis of power and of politics.
Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party. Redistribution Party.
Hello, and welcome to Mandatory Redistribution Party. My name is Jack Lewis Evans. The year is 2031. We thought climate change might be stopped if Jeff Bezos managed to get enough money to afford to save us. If Disney managed to monopolise all creative work on the planet. But sadly, the planet is on fire. The sky is on fire. The sea, which is made of literal water, is on fire. How did we get here? I think you know. The real question is, how do you stop it? I'm sending this message back in time to you, Mandatory Redistribution Party listener. In this episode, I interview Mathew Lawrence, the founder and director of Commonwealth, the UK-based think tank that designs ownership models for a democratic and sustainable economy, who has co-written the new book, Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown. Heed the wisdom within. Save yourselves. My timeline is doomed, and I'm under attack by quite a lot of robots and fire, so I gotta go. Thank you for enabling me to survive as long as I have with your generous support at patreon.com/mandatory redistribution party. And thank you to those of you who share episodes on social media. We really appreciate it. The last thing Sean said before he was burnt to a crisp was, thank them for the retweets. If you do nothing else, thank them for the retweets. I feel like if we're talking about climate change, if we're talking about the planet on fire, I don't think we should start with planet. I think we should start within with the fear. For me, it fades in and out of my awareness. And I think if I think about it too much, I have the fear of both climate change. I've got climate dread, and I also have fear of that fear. I fear that truly understanding the situation we're in and actually acting rationally on that reality would lead to some wild behaviour. There's many layers of the fear. So my question to you, Matt, is do you remember when the fear first hit you?
Yeah, is fear just like a constant feeling, a sort of accompaniment to being sort of alive in a planet on fire? No, I think probably like a while ago now, but like, you know, looking back to like, I don't know, like Copenhagen, the sort of, you know, completely like catastrophic failed conference. And I was studying in the US at that time. And it was kind of like, Obama, the sort of great savior of the world, you know, in his speech the year before, whenever it was, had said like, well, he's going to turn back the tides and, you know.
Rising sea levels threaten every coastline. More powerful storms and floods threaten every continent. More frequent droughts and crop failures breed hunger and conflict in places where hunger and conflict already thrive. On shrinking islands, families are already being forced to flee their homes as climate refugees. Our prosperity, our health, and our safety are in jeopardy. And the time we have to reverse this tide is running out. And yet, we can reverse it.
And I think that's one of the things that makes the situation so terrifying is the limitations of liberal institutions and leaders, like not even the right wing people, but that kind of technocratic centrists like the Obama administration, summits like Copenhagen, and how they just failed. I mean, Obama specifically gave that speech, then opened more land and oceans to oil and gas drilling than anyone before. The number of oil and gas rigs rose like 18% during the Obama administration. He sold access to 2.2 billion tons of coal deposits. He pushed fucking gas as like a green alternative, loads of which comes from fracking, which he massively expanded, and then just hit some of his own targets domestically, but just exported shitloads of it globally. So there's this disconnect between the rhetoric of people like that, who aren't even like the worst fuckers, and then there's this ticking clock, which some people think is already past zero. Then there's the fact that this isn't just about the weather getting a bit hotter like your favourite boomer uncle thinks. It's about not being able to grow food. It's about mass extinction. Like climate dread, the fear, capital T, capital F, comes from this giant problem and the fact that the solutions seem so far out of reach.
But I think one of the key things in some ways is that, yes, this is a sort of interconnected systemic crisis that is not just about rising temperatures linked to emissions. It's about biodiversity collapse. It's about agricultural yields declining due to sort of soil fertility. It's about a whole sort of set of environmental factors. But that fear, the fear, it shouldn't be demobilizing. It should be like the trigger to sort of collective action. Like there's still a window of opportunity here, and there's always time to act. 1.5 is much better than 1.7, but 1.7 is much better than 2, etc., etc. So there's always an imperative to act, and so the fear should be a trigger towards that.
So what you're saying is resist doomerism, folks. Don't despair, organise.
Yeah.
You got to ignore the voice in your head saying humanity just can't think about problems like this. The end is inevitable. All you can do is learn MMA and build a bunker.
Which actually, in some ways, is more demobilizing, because if it's just kind of like, innate greed and psychological reasons why, humans are ecocidal, etc., etc., that is actually much harder to sort of challenge than actually saying, well, actually, the crisis emerges from the institutions and structures that we have built. And by we, I mean sort of, a narrow sort of set of humans on the planet. But therefore, if it is constructed via sort of social and political institutions, we can recode and remake the institutions, the practices, the forms of living that are currently generating environmental breakdown.
It ain't human nature. It's capitalism, it's imperialism, it's patriarchy, which it's important to remind everyone are not inevitable and the only possible outcomes of human nature. Humans can also be sound.
Yeah, exactly.
This, I think, is a good place to jump into discussing some of the popular myths related to these kinds of ideas, like the tragedy of the commons and the ideas that suggest that humans are just inevitably going to destroy any environment they're in at a certain point. So could you explain the story of what happened on Easter Island?
Popularised by Jared Diamond, airport bookseller extraordinaire, etc. His book called Collapse, which kind of uses the story of Easter Island as a sort of miniature parable of humanity's as a whole's relationship to the earth and then sort of to environmental breakdown. And so the story essentially goes, so some jolly sort of explorative sailors chanced upon this island, and they were like from Europe, and they're like, wow, God, this island's in complete collapse, and what they've clearly done is driven by some sort of like ecocidal sort of innate selfishness of humanity. They've chopped down the last trees that their sort of social and physical infrastructure relied upon. They've overfished the fishing stock. They've basically ruined the civilization, even though they knew by the way they were consuming and organising their local economy, they were sort of driving it towards collapse. And this proves the tragedy of the commons. This proves the sort of innate inability of humans to sort of manage and steward collective resources, and therefore ultimately like humanity's sort of DNA drives us towards environmental destruction and sort of ecological sort of breakdown, which is a very compelling narrative, but the sort of crucial point is that it's not true.
Get wrecked, Jared. It ain't just humans that fuck shit up. It is specifically imperialism and capitalism.
Yeah, exactly. Well, quite. And the quote-unquote explorers, I mean, obviously, what did happen instead was like the people of the Easter Island, so the indigenous communities there, they had essentially managed to create a sort of sustainable balance in how they managed their relationship and steward the resources on the island. They sort of fished fishing stock in a way that's sustainable. They had a sustainable relationship, flourishing relationship with the environment on the island, reached a relatively high standard of living with fairly steady state style economy on the island. And of course, what happened was the sailors arrived, and very quickly they brought with them a whole set of diseases. They sort of introduced, they began taking they literally were taking target practice at Easter Islanders from their boats. They introduced, slave raiding. The things they brought with them and the way they used and extracted the island's resources completely decimated the environment, and that's what drove the sort of sharp decline in biodiversity, in standards of living. And then you could ask yourself, well, what drove? Why were these sailors there? And it wasn't just because in a boat, but it's because they were sort of propelled by a set of logics which were integral to sort of capitalism and through that into imperialism around the need to expand, the need to accumulate, the need to bring relationships, whether it's nature, labour, sort of social relationships, into sort of circuits of commodity exchange, so sort of, and then through that creating money which then expands in this sort of ever expanding circle. And those relationships are mediated via forms of hierarchy, forms of violence, patterns of domination. And so really what, Diamond was right in some ways to say there is a sort of, Easter Island tells a sort of story of the wider world in miniature, but sort of wrong potentially in the lessons, which is instead the lessons are that actually there's these propulsive dynamics of expansion, of enclosure, of extraction, of expropriation, exploitation of nature, natural resources, human relationships, human bodies, human labour. And so we can kind of see, the sort of dynamic there becomes of capitalism as a mode of organising nature and labour, imperialism as a sort of form of expropriating wealth from the global south. There's a whole sort of set of, more systemic drivers, which again goes back to that point that actually that is a much more useful analysis than, it's just because of our innate greediness and we simply can't stop this.
But Matt, have you not considered that our greed is the very thing that will save us, that in capitalism lies our salvation from climate apocalypse? Aren't BlackRock becoming the biggest player in ESGs? Isn't Bill Gates going to put magic electro dust in the atmosphere that will cool us down? Isn't Elon Musk building a mech that's going to just kick the sun further away?
Yeah, I mean, to take Gates, what's interesting is I saw he put out a quote yesterday saying we need to really increase R&D because 50% of the technologies we need to decarbonize don't already exist. So there's no doubt we do need to sort of, expand human creativity and sort of technical know-how in some areas. But at the same time, a key point in some ways is that actually that's not true. We know the sort of technical infrastructures, we know the sort of types of transitions we need, whether it's heating systems, in our sort of land use systems, et cetera, et cetera. In some ways, it's much more a political challenge, and it's about challenging, the power of people like Bill Gates' ability to organize investment, to control the future through those flows of investment, and actually to sort of insist on sort of social and environmental needs, taking priority and primacy. And take stuff like BlackRock, which is the world's largest asset management firm. It sort of is an increasing nodal point in how assets are owned, but sort of whether it's shares, whether in corporations, whether it's bonds, etc. It's a hugely important role. And this thing ESG.
For those listeners who don't know what an ESG is, because I didn't before I researched for this episode, is environmental, social and governance investing, which is trying to be responsible investing.
Yeah, exactly. And it's this form of investing which is supposed to be an index of good behaviour, etc., etc. But there's two things. One, if you dig under the bonnet of these forms of indexes, they're often when you go through the E, the S and the G, they kind of don't really sort of measure up to what we need. And also at the same time, holding equity that isn't necessarily, holding these sort of ESG investment portfolios doesn't necessarily give you the leverage to affect the behaviour of the firms themselves that are doing this. It might have some benefits on the margins, but really, we need a much more holistic approach to the connection between ownership, financing, firm decision-making, and sort of sectoral transitions. Can a sort of reformist agenda improve things? Absolutely. Are there, different institutional formations in which capitalism evolves? Absolutely. And, are there differences between sort of Scandinavian coordinated market capitalism transitioning via sort of, fossil fuel intensive, highly extractive North American, Canadian, they're in some ways one of the worst, Canada, but they get away with it because
Trudeau has gained a lot from simply not being Trump.
Exactly. But nonetheless, there are these underlying dynamics and incentive structures that really do stress and challenge the ability to transition. So, but that is a political challenge because, of course, we're nowhere near moving towards a post-capitalism or whatever you'd want us to describe it anytime soon. So, I do think within that it's important to sort of build up sort of prefigurative demands and prefigurative institutions that organise economic, environmental and social relations on different logics and sort of purposes, while also, a reformist, non-reformist, reformist agenda of like, well, what are the reforms we can win now? So it might be like a very significant expansion in public investment. It might be, that again bends toward logics of meeting environmental and social needs rather than maximising accumulation down the line. It might be about, reforms from managerial prerogative to sort of organised companies, and that instead say, well, actually, we're going to insist on new laws, new regulations that in which the company, which is ultimately sort of institution endowed socially with its powers, its privileges, the prerogative there will be like, how can you generate sustainable in all its dimensions wealth for workers who generate the wealth in the first place, but as well as wider stakeholders, rather than being about an entity that is designed to maximise wealth for external investors and sort of executive management.
Yeah, sort of gutting that those last two things you said are like two of the defining features of capitalism beyond private ownership of the means of production. But your point, I guess, is there's possibilities to rein the horror in, and there's light at the end of the tunnel, right? Even very compromised governments have made some progress. Like 97% of Scottish power comes from renewable. Like India has 4 of the world's 10 largest solar plants. We don't need to go full doomer, folks. There is a way out. Don't succumb to the fear.
Doomerism is a fairly privileged position, not least when so much of the damage, if you look at accumulated emissions, so much of it has come within our lifetime. So it's not like, oh well, this is just a centuries old problem that's just impossible to resolve. And I think you do have a window in which a set of actors that are now sort of at least taking this sort of need to transition seriously, which isn't the same as transitioning seriously, but it opens up the sort of political terrain of saying, okay, well, you've announced these targets, your plans are deeply inadequate to meet them. Like, okay, Biden's done this, fairly large climate stimulus, and yet the tragedy is that is still like deeply inadequate to the scale of transition the US needs to make. The Chinese state's saying 2060 net zero. Admittedly, we probably have less ability to leverage that, but there's an interesting question of what does that mean? How does sort of global South actors, how are they supported in the transition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
If Ethiopia could plant 350 million trees in one day back in 2019, think what wealthy countries of the global north could do.
Yeah.
If we could ever convince our journalists that such things would be possible.
Which would be, I can't remember, it took me 2019, I feel like there's a day of Daily Mail journalists saying incredulously, you want to plant X number of trees. But yeah, I think one of the things though is exactly, going back to housing or, sort of rewilding, etc., is exactly many of the things we need to do to transition aren't just oh, well, that's good, tick boxing, and, it will actually improve our quality of life.
Rewilding would certainly improve my life. Just the idea that there's a wolf, there could be a wolf. Imagine seeing a wolf just in a Tesco car park.
Who needs beavers? Go straight to their apex predators. Even if people say, oh, but China's sort of emitting a lot. The transition makes life better for people here, regardless of so we should do it anyway. Whether it's green, decomodified transport, better insulated housing, sort of cooler, more pleasant sort of environments because of more trees are being planted, wherever it might be. But B, obviously the UK and sort of global north, in general. But the UK is the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution and sort of the exporter of many of these practices, and the work of someone like Andreas Malm in his book Fossil Capital is a good one to sort of dig into in this, but. We have an outsized, historic responsibility, to put it mildly, of how we got here. But we also have, exactly partly because of that outsized responsibility and, how what UK's wealth has accumulated. Historically, we've got outsized capability to act. And so, there's these sort of multiple reasons which say, regardless of what India, China, etc. are doing, although, as you say, it's a lot of interesting stuff going on there, we should be making real efforts to be a first mover here. Just as the UK was first into the fossil fuel-based industrial revolution age, we should really be trying to be the first out of it into a genuinely equitable and sort of post-carbon economy in future.
Eco-socialist revolution now, folks. The People's Republics of Green Britain and Northern Ireland. Let's do it. Let's make it happen.
Indeed.
And for reasons far beyond environmental ones, as you say. Like, we know people can make gains out of crises. The right do it all the time. But also the left's done it. You know, the New Deal came out of the Great Depression. The Russian Revolution sprang from the horrors of the First World War. The NHS was built in the rubble of the Second World War. People already allude to that lineage by referring to the Green New Deal, right?
Yeah, so in a Green New Deal, which I guess listeners might have heard of, but sort of a whole society-wide effort to transform rapidly and justly the infrastructures, institutions and industries of a sort of fossil fuel age to like a post-carbon age. I mean, I think it's a hugely exciting political opening, and I think exactly to do it properly, it requires the type of tools that have been sort of politically prescribed for a long time, except, as you say, in periods of acute crisis, whether that's transformative public investment, whether that's, democratic planning and industrial strategies to sort of reshape consumption and production in a sort of a really structured way, whether it's about the expansion of the public realm. There's a whole host of areas which is really exciting. And I think also, the fact that it really stresses that interconnection between social, climate, racial, economic justice, how they're all entangled and you can't separate them out. And, to do one, you've got to do the other. And it's got to be a holistic, all society, all indexes of inequality-wide effort to push it. Now, of course, that that in its sort of softest forms can potentially collapse back into, the state's going to sort of de-risk investment in renewables, but essentially, rather than have community-owned, energy generation, it's going to let BlackRock, invest by de-risking, whatever it might be. I think the New Deal is interesting because exactly if you look into the New Deal and the differences between some of the radical currents and the sort of the big US union now is called the AFL-CIO, but in the 30s there was the AFL, which I think was the crafts union, a bit more social conservative, and the CIO was essentially quite the US, which is quite interesting in some ways in the 30s and 40s. And someone like Mike Davis's Prisoners of the American Dream is a really brilliant book on this, but had one of those radical even before that, if you look at 1890s, 1920s, like a really radical militant labour movement. And that it's that which actually dragged out some of the interesting concessions from FDR in various points. Just as the New Deal had, cross currents, different currents, social democrats, communists, radical labour movement, large-scale industrial capitalists who wanted restoration of aggregate demand. There's a whole host of movements feeding into it, and there's a whole host of, on the one hand, some of the things the New Deal did were genuinely transformative, decommodifying, rebalancing of power. On the other hand, it was obviously, it sort of sustained and propped up a racialized ordering of...
Yeah, it had this coalition, but it was still dominated by the Democrats. It was a Democratic Party project, as were the Jim Crow laws in the southern states, which the New Deal folks in the federal government did fuck all about.
Exactly, and reliant on this devil's bargain with racist sort of southern political coalition. The point with that, to mild detour, say like the Green New Deal itself will have very different currents from sort of green industrial capital to socialist organisers to apolitical environmental actors who and they might not all want the same thing, but you can begin to hear some of their sort of collective interests and powers to bring change, and some of that might be, towards more of the sort of sustaining the status quo with a bit of a shot in the arm with, investment in green infrastructure. But some of it, I think, really opens up really interesting new political terrains, new institutional trajectories. So I think it remains a sort of hugely important umbrella term, and I think it's about politically contesting that and leveraging out the sort of decommodifying agendas of it. The point that it can't just be about, and this is where Keynesianism in some ways has sort of, or at least Keynes had a sort of, fair, sort of in some ways fairly radical prescriptions in terms of, euthanizing the rentier, sort of, very sort of heavy stress on socializing investment and sort of planning the investment function. But it was ultimately quite a sort of technocratic project. It was a sort of a civilizational project in the sense that Keynes sort of essentially sought to forestall a sort of fascist revolution from the right or a sort of, communist revolution from the left, because he basically really liked Bloomsbury bourgeois society. What it wasn't about was, the extension of democracy into all spheres of society, in the workplace, sort of the commons, in the household, in the state.
So let's follow that thread then, the connection between a democratized workplace and averting ecological crisis.
Yeah, sure. So if we take work, which is in some ways, whether it's wage or unwage, it's one of the key ways we interact with and manipulate and change the natural world and the materials that flow through it. Given the scale of transformation we need and the time horizon to change within it, there will be a lot of work and growth, but of a different kind in the next decade or two if we do this. whether it's transforming housing, rewilding, building infrastructures, reimagining the law. There's a lot of work to be done. This is not sort of like a world where we just go like, great, cool, we'll just down tools and that's it. And so there is a sort of post-carbon coalition growth, which is not like saying it's about pursuing GDP growth for its own sake. It's about growing good work, growing forms of sort of equity, all the rest. But then, so let's take work. So there's there's three bedrock positions. So one would be about sort of rebalancing power fundamentally in the workplace. So that's about basic rights for everyone who works, but also like sort of new forms of collective solidarity. So collective bargaining, trade union rights, as well as a whole set of, other measures to sort of make labour more secure. Then we sort of say, okay, well, fine, but you're also then going to democratise the firm, the institution that organises investment, coordinates production, etc., etc. Currently, coordination, decision-making power is monopolised narrowly, hierarchically, in sort of managerial prerogative, and that's linked to shareholder interests, these consolidated blocks of external investors. So we actually say, well, no, we need to reimagine the firm and democratise it in the sense of a new legal infrastructure, and the law vitally shapes how things operate, which again shows how we can recode things. Workers on boards plus environmental interests have to be the majority of sort of voting power on boards. We need to sort of embed into sort of, company law requirements to decarbonise over a set timetable, not as a sort of nice thing to say in press release, but actually like by law, you have to have and enact plans to reduce material throughput, to reduce emissions, etc., etc. And then sort of new forms of sort of collective ownership from workers, so they actually the wealth that they generate, they then get a great share in rather than being extracted. So democratising the firm through ownership, through governance, through new forms of sort of collective voice. And then the third is building up a sort of set of institutions outside of the labour market to sort of de-stress the link between income and work so that people can live much more freely and then work without the sort of the fact that you've got to sell your labour power to survive and reproduce yourself. So de-stressing that dynamic will then hopefully lead to both a wider rebalancing of power in society, but also then as a result, better forms of work, people having more choice over their own lives, how they work, where they work, when they work. So that would be something like building out of COVID-19, a sort of minimum income guarantee style proposal. People like the Economics Foundation, NEF in the UK have done some work on this. IPR have done some work on this, another think tank. So, no one will fall below a minimum income standard, and that sort of reduces your reliance on the market to work, and so you have power of exit from bad work much more strongly. And then also, and this kind of links to the Green New Deal more broadly, then also alongside that sort of minimum income, a very significant extension of decommodification of key goods, services. So in plainer language, that means of providing as almost a right of residency access to certain goods, certain services, free at the point of use, but sort of paid for out of general taxation. So whether that might be a national free full fibre or free at the point of use, it would still be paid for, by
so an upgraded Super Preston model. Paint your town red and green.
Yeah, exactly. Whether it's municipalities having or indeed sort of Greater Manchester or sort of geographic footprints that sort of cohere together more naturally, like powers to publicly owned electric vehicle, sort of free at the point of use, paid for out of taxation, wherever it might be. So these sort of things. Housing is another obvious one. Very big extension of social housing that is affordable, decent, spaciously sort of designed, and also has exactly these forms of environmental sustainability that many local councils under huge pressure are already delivering, but sort of really amplifying that up. So that type of agenda, and that matters not both because communal forms of luxury and shared goods tend to have less environmental impacts than everyone. If everyone sort of gets in a bus, that's less environmental impacts than everyone getting in a car. And you can just do that for different things. Just think through how shared and communal forms of consumption are lower stress on the environment than like lots of privatized individual consumption. And it also reduces inequality, and it also helps rebalance how we work, because if you can live well outside of the workplace and relying on selling your labour power to live well, then you can you've got much greater power when you do work, to choose good work, to sort of rebalance power between employer and worker, etc., etc.
So basically, make work less evil and more useful, which will be good for everyone and also the planet.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the old masters going from the realm of necessity to the realm of freedom, and sort of like how can we equip people with the capability and resources, everyone, to live freely and well, which doesn't mean a world without work, but it does mean a world in which work is decentered, and when we work, it is much more about flourishing, the development of capabilities, the meeting of needs.
I don't want to revert to my doomer instincts here, Matt, but a lot of what you're saying here seems pretty far away from where we are now. Like, I'll fully concede that some things in the right direction are already happening, but so much what we're talking about here are like massive, radical, dare I say, revolutionary changes to like our entire society and economy. Like, can we do that, do you reckon? Can we do that soon? It would be nice if we could, please. I think many of our listeners would agree. Are such changes possible?
A couple of examples of like paradigmatic shifts in economic and sort of social institutions and relationships, and in particular zero in on sort of Thatcherite revolution as a sort of like obvious, but nonetheless in some ways illustrative example of the type of things that worked. And of course there'll be things that are totally different that need to be done in this context. But some of the things that right to buy, famous Thatcherite policy, transformed housing policy in this country, it was actually prefigured and tested and sort of popularised in places like Wandsworth prior to the Conservative winning. So, like, what are the type of things? And that could it be that in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham can be like a world first leader in the delivery of an electric vehicle, publicly owned stock, and the transformation of Manchester to sort of a 15-minute city.
So we're talking about like prefigurative politics, pressure from below. We can kick off to bring about changes where we live, and that'll eventually build to national or even global changes. I mean, even talking about Burnham on transport, he didn't just nicely and magically start proposing to bring buses back into public control. It was a result of pressure from various people or groups, not least the Better Buses campaign organised by a friend of Mandatory Redistribution Party, Pascal Robinson. We can push for change where we live, creating smaller successes that will eventually break through to these what look like huge leaps forward, that look like huge leaps that come out of nowhere later on, but they've come from kind of organising and prefiguring these things in our communities. So just keep pushing, like Thatcher did. The ladies not for turning, etc.
Exactly. Can just keep pushing. But then, then there was a sort of like, there was the development of a sort of common sense narrative that combined Victorian moralism with a sort of sense of like Britain's in crisis, and only the sort of new right can break through the sort of the impasse of the sort of late 1970s and sort of linked to national renewal. So there's potential lessons there, and like in this crisis, only a sort of popular bloc that's committed to addressing intertwined inequalities while building out better quality of life for all can address this at the scale and speed we need. It's about, mobilising sectoral interest behind that. So trade unions in designing just transitions, the role of sort of certain fractions of green industry, whatever it might be, who are the allies, who are the sectional interests that we can rent as unions that then demand, decarbonised housing stock, etc. So who are the sectoral interests you can pull together? The role of, media and think tanks and ideas generators and disseminators. So that's, the Adam Smith Institute, the IEA, the Institute of Economic Affairs, a whole set of like neoliberal sort of vanguardists who develop these ideas, popularise them, were linked into media spokespeople, key columnists, key editorial sort of sites to disseminate this. So again, what are the type of things we can do here in terms of existing media, building new forms of media, podcasts, etc., disseminating things, but then also a new, and in my sort of day job, so to speak, director of a think tank called Commonwealth, and so that you can look at autonomy, IPR, NEF, MEDAC. There's a whole host of like really exciting organisations, movements, generating ideas, popularising ideas. There was also sort of antagonistic politics central to sort of the political projects, so the loony left, or the Argentine junta, or Brussels, or the enemy within in terms of sort of the trade union movement, etc., etc., etc. There's a whole series, and you could kind of say, well, who might that be? It might be the fossil fuel barons. It might be sort of defenders of a status quo. It might be people who are sort of big pharma saying that we can't waive trips and vaccines patents. So you can kind of see like you can begin to build sort of antagonism, which puts the majority on the many on the few, so to speak. You can see how you can begin to sort of pull all of those things together, and then build Andy Burnham and the buses, but the sort of 78% reduction by 2035. That is an opening, because now it's like, if it goes from like, okay, we need to sort of set a really ambitious target, that target in some ways could be more ambitious still, but setting a target, so like that then, once that's set, it then shifts the politics on to politics of implementation, and then it's like, well, that's a new political trend, and can you move into the implementation, win demands there, and from that move into the granularity of implementation, so like in certain sectors, it's not just about, okay, you need to decarbonise transport, but you actually need to make sure that bus drivers are, have a sort of stake and sit on their company board and trade union rights and collective bargaining and all the so you can kind of see how you can keep advancing. But yeah, it's obviously a challenge because there's political inertia. There's a sense that a disconnect between the necessarily interlinked but like sometimes siloed elements of environmental justice, economic justice, racial justice, which should be all interconnected, but they're sometimes siloed. So there are obviously big gaps between what needs to be done and what's happening. But I guess closing that gap is the job of politics.
And crucially, politics doesn't just mean party politics or winning the next general election. The fight against climate crisis and the capitalism that brings it about isn't just going to be won by one big vote. We need to be organised, we need to be motivated, we need to be on the attack, but not necessarily through, for example, the fucking Labour Party.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's not to sort of say, look, one strand of the strategy should be sort of obviously trying to contest, win, and then democratise and use state power in new and exciting ways. And then obviously that then brings you back to electoral politics and being, some people will be within and then contesting and being beyond the Labour Party, and others will be anti-electoralist or in different parties. So in some ways, there obviously has to be quite a lot of thought into that. But as you say, there are a whole host of other ways, of building social power, mobilising the type of leverage we need to affect change, and it has to be a sort of whole court press sort of strategy and effort, because relying just on electoralism or relying just on the trade union movement or whatever it might be, that they won't be enough on their own. So it needs to be sort of whole court press, and I think that's also then how you get a sense of like energy and momentum going forwards.
Matt, thanks so much for coming on, Mandos. I've enjoyed listening to your ideas, as I'm sure our listeners have. Aside from encouraging folk to buy the book you've written on this stuff, which is, by the way, Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to leave our listeners with in our collective quest to combat doomerism and the fear?
Just the key point I would stress is this is a sort of deep and systemic crisis that necessarily therefore involves a systemic response in finance, in how we work, in sort of scaling up the commons, in sort of extending sort of democracy into all spheres of life. But in particular, that systemic crisis isn't a crisis of our imagination, of our technical ability to decarbonise, etc., etc. It's primarily one of a crisis of power and of politics, which is both presents sort of difficult challenge, but not an insoluble one. This is a challenge that we can contest, reshape, and sort of transform. And so, as difficult as the challenge might seem, sometimes it's actually, in some ways, it's one that not that we sort of can win, it's one we really have to win. And so, I guess that is the collective task for us.
I'm hyped. We can do it, people. Let's go. Let's get on it.
Let's go. Yeah,
let's get on it.
It was more of like, and let's go.
Mandatory Redistribution Party was created and produced by Sean Morley and Jack Evans. Our title theme was created by Ella Jean. Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of environmental breakdown, is by Mathew Lawrence and Laurie Leyburn Langton. It's published by Verso and available now. Thanks for listening, and big, flaming planet-sized thank yous to those of you who support us on Patreon or share episodes on social media. Stay safe, folks. Till next time.